Hello, I'm Ted Morrissey, and this is a video from my revisionist Shakespeare course. And today I'm focusing on The Tempest, one of my favorites. I know I say that about all of them, but it's true of all of them. Um, I think I want to focus on a couple of aspects of The Tempest, which I think contemporary writers can draw from it for inspiration for their work. Since this is a course focused on revisionist fiction, I thought that would be appropriate. Um, and like I said, there's a couple of features in the play that are unusual among Shakespeare's canon, and those are the two features I want to kind of draw upon. Somebody on the discussion board uh, made the assertion that they thought that The Tempest was one of the most male dominated of Shakespeare's plays which tend to be male dominated anyway, which is certainly true. And I was curious about that. I mean, it seems it's a valid comment to be sure. I'm just kind of thinking off the top of my head, and I thought, well, the Henry plays particularly strike me as being really male dominated, and so I wanted to kind of check that out. And so to do that, I went to this book. If I can lift it up, oh my gosh. It's the collected works, but it's the Royal Shakespeare Company edition of collected works. It came out in 2007, and it's edited by Jonathan Bate and Eric Rasmussen. I really like Rasmussen, particularly as a Shakespeare scholar. As we know, Emma Smith is my favorite Shakespeare scholar, but Eric Rasmussen is right up there. And I have several collected works that I've collected over the years, starting with the Riverside edition, which I got as an undergraduate with my first introduction to Shakespeare course many years ago. But over time, I've collected several collected works, and they all have somewhat different features. So depending sort of on what I'm interested in terms of a particular play, I'll go to this versus that collection. I've got the Norton anthology, of course, and like I said, I've got some others, but I really wanted to get a hold of this one, which has kind of become known as the Yellow Shakespeare. I'll let you try to figure that one out, because it is deliberately unique from a lot of the other collected works. For one thing, because it is the Royal Shakespeare Company's collection, it emphasizes performance over just reading the plays necessarily. And so there's a lengthy section of photographs and other kinds of renderings, graphic renderings from different productions, and a discussion of how it was produced, and how that particular production may have been different from other productions and so forth. So that's really interesting. So Shakespeare, from a performance standpoint, more so than other collected works, which tend to have a more sort of scholarly textual emphasis, although there's plenty of scholarly textual emphasis in here as well. The other thing that's unusual about this is it's based on the first folio, and so that is somewhat different from other collected works, and it has a lot of just additional material in it. It's got all the sonnets and all the poems, and it's got a detailed description of the probable chronology of the plays. It's got some plays that, or portions of plays at least, that they presume that Shakespeare had a hand in writing, and so they have that involved. So anyway, just a lot of stuff. But one of the other features they have that made me go to this collection to kind of ponder that issue of whether the Tempest is among the most male dominated of the plays, and my thought that maybe the Henry plays might be even more male dominated, was that each play, there's an analysis of it which includes like the each character and the number of lines that they have in the play, and then the percentage that equals in terms of the amount of the dialogue that they have versus the other characters and so forth. So that's a really neat way of looking at and seeing something like that. So you can go and very quickly look at, okay, the male characters, based on their names, have X percentage of lines, and the female characters, based on their names, have X percentage of lines. And so it kind of bore all that out. Yeah, definitely the Tempest is male heavy, male dominated, as are the Henry plays. And I didn't look at all of the plays, so I don't have a complete list in mind. But it certainly is a valid comment that the Tempest, certainly compared to probably the most popularly performed plays, is especially male dominated. Okay, so anyway, I highly recommend the Royal Shakespeare Company, William Shakespeare Complete Works. It's 2,500 plus pages long, so it's heavy, even in the paperback edition. But if you have an interest in Shakespeare, and if you teach Shakespeare, I would definitely recommend getting a hold of the Royal Shakespeare Company collected works, because it just has a lot of interesting information that you really can't find in other collected works. All right, so let's get to the Tempest. And like I said, I wanted to focus on a couple of features of the text, which I think we as contemporary writers can certainly draw from for inspiration, if not, trying to mimic exactly. And one of those is that music and performance was a part of all of Shakespeare's plays, essentially. For one thing, the audiences of the day expected it. So even though maybe Shakespeare himself wasn't always known as someone who would produce the music, he inserted that into the plays somehow or another. Oftentimes, it's kind of integrated into the plot of the play somehow or another. Sometimes it really just seems more of a almost sort of just an extra item, kind of plopped into the play just for entertainment value or whatever. But the study of the music and the lyrics in Shakespeare's plays. The music is much more of a mystery, of course, but obviously we have the lyrics. Is a whole nother sort of branch of Shakespeare's scholarship, and the Tempest has a lot of musical numbers in it compared to other Shakespeare's plays. Now, I'm not a musician, unfortunately. I wish I had pursued something like that. I started, like a lot of people, as a kid to study some instruments, and for whatever reason, didn't pursue it. But in retrospect, I really wish that I had. So I don't have a very good grasp of musicology and all of that. But I think a kindred sort of thing is the use of poetry, and I definitely use poetry in my prose. As you know, I try to make my prose as poetic as I can, but then just out and out poetry. I oftentimes write about writers or poets, as characters, and so I will kind of in their name write poetry and insert it into the text to propel the narrative somehow or another, or color the narrative, or some kind of verb like that. And so I would encourage you to think about that, to think about maybe bring into your prose a different sort of text, and poetry is a good option to think about, to just add a sort of different textual layer to your narrative. Um, if you have some musical talent or skills, you certainly could try to include those directly. Now, James Joyce actually wrote music for his books, and so there's actual musical score in some of his novels. And so, if you have a composition streak like that in you, maybe you could actually write music. Now, again, if you don't read music, it doesn't mean a lot to the average reader. But here's something to think about. I recently read, I think it was just published in 2021, or at least the translation was, a book titled Chasing Homer. And unfortunately, the writer's name is Laszlo. I'm not remembering. It was library borrowed books. I don't have it with me, and I looked it up online, but I'm having trouble with the name. But nevertheless, what I wanted to talk about was, it's a really interesting little novella. Again, Chasing Homer. It sort of is revisionist in itself, in that it kind of plays with the idea of Homer the poet, and the Odyssey and all that kind of thing. But it has a lot of intertextual features, and one of them is graphics. So there's several uh, art pieces, paintings or drawings in the text. But here's the really interesting feature. At the beginning of each little chapter, there's a QR code. And if you scan that with your phone, the QR code takes you to a SoundCloud file that has a little musical score. Not very long, not super complicated. I mean, it tends to be just one or two instruments, that kind of thing. But and it doesn't take a long time to listen to, maybe a minute or so. But the idea is that it sort of sets the mood for that particular chapter that you're about to read. And technologically, nowadays, that kind of thing would actually be quite simple to do. To record a brief, original musical score, upload it to SoundCloud or some other kind of online, audio site like that, and then create, a QR code that's easy enough to do, and actually then embed that in your text of your novel or your short story or whatever it might be. Or who knows, take it, kind of combine what I've been talking about and insert poems into your text, but read them aloud. And then have a QR code that takes the reader to you reading your own poem aloud. There's just all sorts of possibilities. The technology is just so readily available now, and we can do so much creatively that other generations of writers and artists just couldn't do. And I always think about artists who were interested in the technology of their day and what they would do today. They'd just be going hog wild with all the technological options out there that we probably take for granted a little bit. So think about that. Think about bringing music into your prose, either by inserting poems that you've written, and you could take it even a step further and actually record something, either music or the poem, or if you've got a singing voice, sing a song, upload it to a cloud somewhere, and then use a QR code or some other sort of device to help your reader get to it. I published a book a few years ago by Grant Tracy, and in the paperback edition, I'd asked Grant to come up with a sort of score for his novel, and we didn't do it as sophisticated as what I just described, but Grant, found he's a big jazz fan, and jazz kind of is one of the motifs of his mysteries that we published, and so he selected a particular jazz song that he thought kind of went with that chapter, kind of thematically or mood wise or whatever, and so then we published this playlist as part of the paperback edition, and someone could go to Spotify or iTunes or wherever and could look up that song and listen to it, as you're reading or before you read or whatever, obviously however you want to do it. So that was a little lower tech version of that, but creating a playlist, for your novel or for your collection of stories or whatever it might be, and just giving that to the reader and letting them kind of on their own device. Look up. We all have access to whole music libraries, which again, something we very much take for granted. Certainly, when I was a young person, that wasn't a thing. You couldn't just go somewhere and listen to essentially any song ever recorded that you wanted to. But now we can. All right. So anyway, that's one of the things I wanted to talk about. The other aspect of the Tempest, which is unusual in Shakespeare's work, I've kind of alluded to this elsewhere in the course, but is the fact that most of, I should say most of, but essentially every other Shakespeare work is a sort of revision of its own. It's taking an earlier story or maybe two or three different source texts, and Shakespeare sort of reimagining them, reinventing them into a new version. But not so much with the Tempest. There is no sort of source text that we can find that seems to have been the basis for the Tempest. It seems like a much more original work on Shakespeare's part. Um, Obviously there are allusions to classical works in the play itself, and one can certainly find different influences that probably impacted Shakespeare, inspired Shakespeare as he was writing The Tempest. But as far as having a specific source text or a couple of source texts, that doesn't seem to be the case. Instead, what we have is his using very contemporaneous events, shipwreck, etc., that was all the buzz in London at the time, and taking that very contemporary event and using it as source for the text of the play, and he was starting to do that perhaps with The Winter's Tale, in that the character of Antilochus, the sort of prankster thief who's pickpocketing people and that kind of thing. There's a suspicion that maybe Shakespeare was basing that on some of the criminal element that was really starting to evolve in the streets of London at the time, with pickpockets and other kinds of petty thieves that one had to be aware of on the streets of London. So maybe he developed that character and that idea for The Winter's Tale from that contemporary phenomenon of the sort of rise of this sort of thievery. But then he took it to a new level, perhaps with The Tempest, and basing basically the entire plot of the story on contemporaneous events. Now, I'm one to write about past stuff. For me, things I experience usually have to marinate for quite a while before I feel like I'm ready to write about them in a fictive way. But not everybody's like that, and I want to share this with you. This is the newest edition of the Sewanee Review, which I subscribe to. I think maybe I've alluded to it before in this course, maybe another, I don't know. But this just arrived last week, and this is a short story by Sarah Harshbarger. And unfortunately, the title is in French, which is not my second language. So I'll just show it to you there. But it is a COVID story. I presume you probably don't have a copy of this. And when Sarah comes out with her collected stories, maybe it's been will have been long enough that if I do a little bit of a spoiler here, it won't actually spoil when you read the story. It's really good. I like the story, very well written, and all those kinds of things. But again, the reason I wanted to bring it up is because it's very, very contemporary. It's set during the COVID-19 lockdown. Just the basic plot: the main character who's American, has gone to France, a little village in France, to meet up with a lover, and the idea was it was going to be a fairly brief, little stay. She's a documentary filmmaker, and she's got like a grant, I think, to go and make this film, and so she's going to be there for a while. But really, that's kind of the ulterior motive. It's mainly to hook up with this young lady that she is having a relationship with. But once she gets there, COVID strikes. And so now as the story begins, she's been sort of marooned there for a number of weeks. And things are not quite as blissful with the partner as she was hoping they would be. They're all kind of cooped up together. There's a third person who lives in the apartment with them. There's a curfew in the village, so the village streets are pretty dull and empty, especially after the curfew, obviously. Then she finds out a relative has COVID-19, has been hospitalized, and so there's conversations back and forth with her other relative, and then the relative who is in the hospital has to use an iPad to communicate, but can't because they're on a ventilator. So anyway, all of those sort of classic elements of the pandemic, and particularly the initial lockdown of the pandemic, have been kind of morphed into this little short story. Now, there's other things happening in the short story. Like I said, it's very well done. I very much enjoyed reading it, but it's the first COVID-19 work of fiction that I've encountered. Now, maybe I'm sure there are others out there. I just haven't read them. I try to keep a pretty good pulse on brand spanking new fiction, particularly. I subscribe to several literary magazines, and just kind of keep a watchful eye to that sort of thing. And so, I'm probably as aware as most people would be, or more so than most people would be, of that kind of thing. And I just haven't seen a COVID story quite like this, that's so contemporary and draws from so many of the things that definitely happened to so many people that most of us probably only kind of experienced through news reports. We knew it was going on, but we didn't, fortunately, maybe have direct, experience with it. But this writer, again, Sarah Harshbarger, show you the title again. She has taken these very, very contemporary events and written a very nice little, literary short story. So maybe you could draw some inspiration from some very contemporary events. Like I said, I think it's a little bit tricky because things change so quickly, but still you're trying to capture a sort of moment in time, and the time span of the short story itself is very narrow. So it isn't something that tries to cover a long period of time, but so just looking at that little slice of history, that's kind of what the writer is drawing from. So anyway, that's what I'll leave you with. The two thoughts about incorporating them into your writing. One is bringing some other kind of lyrical text into your prose, whether it's a poem, whether it's a song, maybe using technology to literally let the reader access that song, or maybe you're reading your poem aloud, something like that. And then the other idea of using very, very contemporaneous events to write your fiction. So with those two thoughts, I will leave you. I'd be curious to hear your ideas about both of those issues, maybe some examples that you know of either incorporating, poetry or technology into prose, or, writing about COVID or other contemporary events. Maybe share some of those examples with us as well. All right. So I will see you down the digital road.